we have to talk briefly, at least, about what happened and make some guesses about why this might have occurred. I've said this to some of you before, but this is how the biblical tradition was transmitted. All the biblical texts that we read, particularly in the Hebrew Bible, until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the late 1940s and early mid 1950s, the very oldest Hebrew manuscript we had of the text that we read comes from nearly 1000 AD, not BC. A millennium and a half after these texts were written originally. Why is that the case? Well, it is because obviously the texts were written at some time in the history of Israel. Most scholars assume that a lot of them may have been written down in the exile in Babylon in the 6th century BCE. And then they were copied and copied and copied and copied and copied and copied, literally hundreds of times. And over those centuries of copying, various things happened to the text. And text critics, we always like to say, those of us who are in this business, I'm not a text critic. Text critics are those you can always tell them because they have very bad eyesight and they're always hunched over, their backs are all, because they spend all day long lurking over text, looking deeply into these very difficult texts to read. And many of them are brilliant people, but they're nerds, to say the least, linguistic nerds. And I have great appreciation for linguistic nerds. But the fact remains that we don't have original texts at all, never have. And what we've got are multiply copied texts. Sometimes those texts were very badly transmitted. Now, exactly why, there's no reason, there's no explanation necessarily, no rational explanation about why. Beyond the book of Job, which is among the very worst of the transmitted books, there's the book of Hosea, the prophet Hosea in the Hebrew Bible. That is a terrible text. It was really very poorly transmitted. Why? I don't know. I just don't know. It's very hard to read in the language. You're reading it and suddenly it collapses. And I said this at the beginning when we started this study some weeks ago, that the book of Job has lots of problems in it linguistically, and we're going to see some of those tonight for sure.
Yeah.
Now, so it's just important to know that you get to certain places in the book and you just can't read it. It's very, very difficult to try to decipher. And no matter how much Hebrew you can read, the Hebrew is just so weird and so bizarre and so truncated and so disjointed that it sometimes just doesn't make much sense. And tonight, we're just going to zip through some of this stuff because I can't really make any sense of it. I really cannot say much about certain parts of it at all because it's just badly transmitted. Now, again, I say, why? I don't know. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the middle of the last century, there was a tremendous amount of excitement among scholars because the thought was, well, goodness, these are very ancient witnesses to the original text. Some of them are the Isaiah scroll from Qumran. It's a great scroll. If you've been to Israel, it's wrapped around a great spindle in the shrine of the book in Jerusalem. It's a brilliant thing. And you can read it. I mean, you can read it as if it were written yesterday. And that's 2,200 years old at least. And that is very like the Isaiah text that we had up to that point. So the text sometimes was really well transmitted and copied, but sometimes it was not. Now, sometimes in my more cynical moments, I wonder if whether or not copiers who were copying these texts over a long period of time, if they didn't find in the book of Job a lot of stuff they didn't like, if they just, it was too weird, too far out theologically for some of them. And I wonder if they didn't just play with it some. They just didn't want it to be simple. And I don't know that that's true. That's my own opinion about some of it. I really don't know. But tonight, when we go through some of this third cycle, it's a mess. And I got some stuff from John earlier this week. There have been attempts over the years by various translators and readers to reorder this material, to make it sort of sound right. If you have a Jerusalem Bible, which was very popular in the 1970s and 80s or so, it's a Roman Catholic translation, essentially. They literally altered the text. They just took a piece from here and a piece from there and put it in the text as if that's the way it was. There is absolutely no evidence at all from any other translation. And we have a lot of translations. We have the, not just the Qumran ones, of course. We also have a translation, an Aramaic translation written in a language called Syriac. We have all manner of course, the Latin Vulgate from the 4th century AD, and on it goes. There's not a single bit of evidence that the text of Job that we have is any significantly different in those translations than the one that we've got, except occasionally the Septuagint, the Greek translation from the 4th, 3rd centuries BCE. It, as I said to you a couple of weeks ago, is longer at some places and closer and shorter at other places. Much more about Job's wife, for example, much less in certain of the chapters. So that translator may have been reading another Hebrew text that we don't have anymore. Don't know. The struggle to sort of try to understand this text has been ongoing, and we'll see some of that tonight, how really difficult some of it is. So just keep that in your mind as we go through some of the material here. There'll be places here that are just impossible to get your head around. It just is not possible to read it. And I'll show you those places as much as we can, much time we've got. Now, what I want to do tonight, some of that, of course, but then also I want to ask a couple of questions of you. And the first question I've got is, how do you understand chapter 28, the poem of wisdom? If you read this at all, you will see that that just sort of stands out like a sore thumb. All of a sudden, you've got all this dialogue between Job and the friends, supposedly, and suddenly you get this poem of wisdom. It's a lovely poem. Some of the best poetry in the book actually is in chapter 28, written by somebody who knew how to write. But it certainly doesn't sound much like anything we've read up to now. What's it doing there? What are the possibilities of that? And we'll get into that. And then secondly, I want to ask you, what do you make of Elihu? 6 chapters of that guy who just suddenly appears out of nowhere and goes on at considerable length about whatever he's talking about, and then disappears at the end of chapter 37. You never hear him again. When God responds at the end of the book, God speaks about the 3 friends. There's no talk about Elihu. Who wrote that? What's its design? What's its point? Well, I have an opinion about that one, and I don't know that it's true. As I said to the very beginning of this, I want to try to read the book I've got. I don't want to try to rearrange it or suggest that some of it is secondary and written by somebody else. I don't want to do that. This is the book we have, chapters 1 to 42, and I want to try to make sense of it as much as I can. Sometimes I find it very difficult to do that, and most people have found it difficult. But I think there's still some rationale you could give, and I've got some rationales about various stuff that we'll talk about tonight too, okay? So that's the introductory stuff, just to kind of get your mind going. When we get to chapter 28, I'm going to ask you why you think it's there. And when we get to the Elihu speeches, 32 to 37, I'm going to ask you why you think that's there too. So just get that in your mind as we think through it a bit together, okay? Now, chapter 22 is Eliphaz's third speech. And I think something very unusual goes on in this speech. Not so unusual given the way I'm trying to read it. That is, as I've said from the beginning, Eliphaz, like the other friends, takes one look at Job in chapter 2, and because he's on an ash heap with nothing, he is immediately convinced that Job is evil and proceeds then to operate with that in his mind. People don't end up on ash heaps with nothing unless they are evil. That's the reality of their theology. That's the way it works, okay? For all three of the friends, and for Elihu too, of course. And now, as I also tried to say, Eliphaz, in his first speech in chapters 4 and 5, is clearly the kind of orator and wise scholar and preacher that he is not used to anybody questioning what he says. And so when Job starts questioning, and very angrily and very pointedly, Eliphaz becomes, I would suggest to you, increasingly angry himself and increasingly desperate to find a way to shut Job up. Because if there is such a thing in the universe as an innocent person who is being assaulted by God, or is somehow the universe is not treating this person in a what they would consider a just way, then their whole theological position is under threat. And when people have their theological positions under threat, they tend to get very nasty. And they certainly have interest in destroying, rejecting with tremendous power anybody who disagrees. Now, I trust most of you in your own families or in your own life as church people have had a debate or a discussion or two with persons with whom you don't agree. Those persons with whom you do not agree tend to be pretty passionate and energetic about their beliefs, and you in turn become pretty passionate, energetic about your beliefs. And sometimes that results in clashing and a knocking of heads. And we've all been in these places, I trust, where the heads get knocked. And that's where we are in the book of Job in the third cycle. That the friends think that they've got all the right answers, and Job is telling them they do not have all the right answers. And their response is increasingly filled with invective and fury because they simply cannot allow Job to be right at all, or their whole position falls to pieces. Now, the irony of this for me is beginning right at the beginning of the speech of Eliphaz. Look, if you got your Bible there, look at chapter 22, beginning with the very first verse, which is verse 2, of course, in English. Job has concluded, you remember, his speech in chapter 21, very angrily describing, saying to the friends that they are useless, they don't know what they're talking about, that evil people live long, happy lives, and good people die young, and all that stuff. And of course, Eliphaz not having that. That can't be right, not in his theology. So he begins with a very astonishing phrase. And I pondered this one a long time as I reflected on this book. And look what you think he's trying to say here. Here is the New Revised Standard Version's translation, which is not bad, actually. He starts, "Can a mortal be of use to God?" Now, you remember Eliphaz earlier on in chapter 4, what did he say from that great vision that he had? Can a mortal be righteous before God? And the implication is a rhetorical question, I trust, and the answer is no, not really. But now he changes this slide. Notice how he changes this here. Can a mortal be of use to God? Can even the very wisest of human beings be of any service to God at all? Now watch verse 3, look at this. Is it any pleasure to Shaddai? Does God find pleasure, joy, if you are righteous? Isn't he gain to God if you make your ways blameless? Isn't that an astonishing idea? Now, roll that around in your head for a moment. What is he saying there? Before, it was a question of Job, they think, claims he's righteous and he's getting it for no reason. And they claim, no, you're not righteous at all. That's absurd. No human being is righteous before God. Well, I can make sense of that from the vision. But now Eliphaz claims not only does God not care about righteousness, but God doesn't care about usefulness. God finds no pleasure in your own righteousness. You can be righteous or not. God doesn't care. Well, good heavens. Isn't that what Job's been saying? Hasn't Job been saying almost from the very beginning? That's what I've been telling you guys. In chapter 9, God destroys both the righteous and the wicked and laughs while people die. God doesn't care about righteousness or wickedness at all. It's all just a great disaster in God's face, as far as I can tell, says Job. And if I read this as one possible hearing of this, Eliphaz now gives the game away to Job by saying suddenly, look, not only does God doesn't care if you're righteous or not, God doesn't care if you're useful or not. God doesn't care at all. And what Eliphaz does, in effect, is to push God further and further and further out into the wilds of the universe, turning to God in some sort of deistic figure, I guess, who has no interaction with human beings, whatever. And I can only think, Eliphaz, imagine, I think he's been driven to this. I think he's to the point now where he can't think straight. I think his carefully designed theological position is falling to pieces right before your eyes. And even he doesn't realize that, but oh my gosh, I think it has. And so then he goes on in this and talks about, oh, is it for your piety he reproves you, enters into judgment? He goes back to his old stuff about how you're impious. But what difference does it make now? Once he's admitted, once he's said or claimed that God doesn't care about your righteousness or doesn't care about your value at all, then all this talk about God attacking you because you're evil doesn't make any sense. It makes no sense at all anymore. It's useless. He's finally shown the emptiness, I would suggest, of his theological position. It is an empty, hopeless position to continue to believe that God rewards and punishes. It just doesn't happen. And Eliphaz, in his meanderings and his wild attempts to destroy Job, has, in my mind, as I understand this, destroyed his own position. And when I think about if this is a play, as I've tried to say from the beginning, I always picture Eliphaz. This is his last speech, you remember. He says at the end, oh, when others are humiliated, you say it with its pride. He saves the humble. He'll deliver even those who are guilty. They'll escape because of the cleanness of your own hands, or something like that. The text is not very clear there. But the point is, Eliphaz ends his speech in a typical preacher mode. But after he's claimed that God doesn't care one way or the other, does it mean anything? The answer is no, it doesn't. So I picture in my play, Eliphaz, if he's a modern figure, his suit is now unbuttoned, his shirt has been untucked, his platform shoes have broken off a heel, and his hat has fallen off, and he stumbles off the stage. And I would suggest everybody in the audience is booing and throwing rotten fruit at him at this point. I think he has basically been humiliated by his own language. And there's no value in it anymore. And then Job in 23, it's a bitter complaint again. In 23, it sounds very much like the Job that we've known. Oh, if I only knew where I might find God, if I could come to God's dwelling, Eliphaz has said, oh, I've had this vision of God. Yes, I've seen God and the whisper and all that stuff. And Job says, well, easy enough for you to say. If I could find God, in verse 4, I would lay my case before God. And now it gets that courtroom thing going again. If I just could find God, we could have it out together. I could show that God has been wrong. God has made a mistake this time. Either God is confused or God has made an error with me, accusing me of being the sea monster in chapter 7, or whatever it is. It's God's problem, not mine. And I want to get God back in the court. And there's this wild, crazy thing that Job has in his sort of half demented mind at this point. Verse 6, would God contend with me in the greatness of his power? No. What he wanted in chapter 9, you remember, was that umpire to take God's power away. So he's got that in his mind again. If only I can go there, I can find God without God's power. We can have it out, God and I. Oh, but in verse 8, if I go forward, God isn't there. Backward, I can't see God. On the left, God hides. I can't behold God. I turn to the right, can't see God. I don't know where God is. God hides. Oh, but he knows the way I take. When he tests me, I'll come out like gold. Oh, my foot is held fast to his steps. I have kept his way. And there's this desperation in Job's voice, I think, in chapter 23. The friends have failed him completely, and he's turned away from them. They have nothing to say. And Eliphaz has just revealed his emptiness, I would suggest. And now Job is directly interested in seeing God, but he can't find God anywhere. Oh, if he stands alone, verse 13, who can dissuade him what he desires that he does? I can't. It's just like Job in chapters 9, 10, as we saw earlier in the first cycle of speeches. I am terrified in God's presence, he says in verse 15. When I consider I'm in dread, God has made my heart faint. The Almighty has terrified me. If only I could just vanish in darkness, and thick darkness would cover my face. That's his desire, of course, again, to go to Sheol and get away from God, essentially. So that's where we are now. Now things get very awkward. Certainly, chapter 24 at the beginning sounds like Job, doesn't it? Chapter 24, verse 1. Why are there not times kept by the Almighty? Why do those who know him never see his days? The wicked remove landmarks. Landmarks in the ancient world are boundary stones, and it was the worst thing you could possibly do. Many ancient Near Eastern texts describe terrible curses for those who have the temerity to move boundary stones, to enlarge their own property at the expense of somebody else. It's a terrible thing to do, and that's what Job is saying here. Wicked remove landmarks. They seize flocks and pasture them. They drive away the donkey of an orphan. They take the widow's ox for a pledge. I mean, these are terrible, wicked deeds. They thrust the needy off the road. The poor of the earth all hide themselves. And now the text absolutely collapses. I don't know, frankly, what verses 5 through 17 really say. And I certainly don't know what verses 18 to 25 say. They are a disaster in the Hebrew text. And whatever the NRSV has or any translation you've got, they're guessing. They're changing the text. They're moving it around. They're altering it in all kinds of ways. I just don't know what it says. And I'm not going to make any comment about it at all. But now chapter 25, we get the shortest speech in the book, at least according to the book we have in front of us, and that's Bildad. And it's a sad, tragic speech, as you can see. Chapter 25, this is Bildad's second speech. Dominion and fear are with God. God makes shalom in God's high heaven. Is there any number to God's armies? Upon whom does God's light not arise? How then can a mortal be righteous before God? Ah, that's Eliphaz, isn't it? Eliphaz from chapter 4. He's quoting Eliphaz directly. How can one born of woman be pure? Rhetorical question, answer, no. Verse 5, if even the moon is not bright and the stars are not pure in God's sight, how much less a mortal who is a maggot and a human being who is a worm. The end. Amen. That's the end of Bildad's speech. Now, various translators, as I said, have tried to take some stuff from chapter 26 and move it up there to make it sound like, and it sounds sort of Bildad-ish, I suppose, in 26. And you could do that, but the fact is it's not, because it's, according to the book, you see, chapter 26, then Job answered, it says in chapter 26. But this can't be a speech of Job. It sounds like a friend's speech. But again, the text is not very clear. It sounds very much like sort of wicked talk about the wicked are going to get what they deserve and all that sort of stuff again. But I would argue, given the speech, the book that I have in front of me, it is not as a matter of fact, unlikely that Bildad's last speech in this book is a despairing one, an angry, sad, despairing one, because his theology is empty. It's been empty from the beginning, and now it really is empty. The conclusion of believing like Bildad is to believe that all human beings are nothing but maggots and worms, and that's the end. Well, that will hardly do. And so I would suggest in the play, Bildad stumbles off the stage also. And now Job is alone because there's no speech of Zophar at all. The friends have been defeated. Their theological position has been made mockery. And Job is now alone on the stage. And the spotlight is on him and the friends are gone. And now this is when we expect, of course, and particularly after the beginning of chapter 27, we expect Job and God are going to have at it. And God's going to come and clear this up in one way or another, or Job is going to clear it up or something. There's going to be a confrontation between the two of them, and that's going to somehow conclude the book. Well, we'll get to that eventually, but it doesn't happen, does it? It doesn't. We have a lot of stuff in between here, and all kinds of stuff is still to be looked at. Job again, verse chapter 27, took up his discourse, which is slightly different. It isn't he answered and said this time. He continued his discourse, it says. As God lives, who has taken away my right, and Shaddai, who has made my soul bitter, as long as my breath is in me and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils, my lips will never speak falsehood, my tongue will never utter deceit. Far be it from me to say that you are right. Until I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. I hold fast my righteousness and will not let it go. My heart does not reproach me for any of my days. That's about as straightforward a speech as you're going to find in the book, really. Job is convinced that his vindication is at stake and that God is wrong and he is right. And the world is a mess, and he must hear from God. And you think, oh gosh, surely now, I mean, isn't that going to cause God to show up? No, it does not cause God to show up. We get a very long speech after this in chapter 27, beginning with the 7th verse, which sounds again like a speech of the friends. Now, again, you can make all kinds of movements and drop this in with Bildad's second speech in 25, all that, third speech in 25, but I don't think that's helpful. I think we just should avoid that and now get to the speech of wisdom. Okay, why is this here? What is chapter 28 doing in the middle of this narrative of the book of Job? What do you think? Any questions, any ideas of it? Pretty weird, all right. There have been any number of suggestions about this. So there's not a right answer here, because every translation has this chapter in it. I mean, this wasn't just in the Hebrew text. It's in every translation.
Well, there are versions of God that say God is wisdom.
Right.
And so this could be a poetic description of God, hard to find, but of great value if you do find it.
Right.
It doesn't seem to be making any accusations against Job.
Nope, it doesn't at all.
And then there's that plural pronoun that we seem to be adopting again.
Right, that's true.
It's a lot like polytheism to some people.
Yeah, it would sort of sound that way, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
So tell me, Nancy, why do you think it's here? What, I grant all that. I mean, it is about wisdom. It's about God. God is the only one who knows where wisdom is. I mean, human beings can do all kinds of stuff, it says.
Yeah.
But they can't find wisdom. They can't find it. And nobody can find it. Only God has it.
And the fear of the Lord is beginning of wisdom.
Right.
So maybe this is an introduction to God's gonna come and straighten you out.
It could very well be that.
Possibly.
It might be somebody's idea that now it's time to hear from God. I mean, it might be an introductory poetic announcement, if you will, a kind of narrator's announcement. Da-da-da, here's God. Could be that. Yeah. Yeah, Diana.
I wonder if it could be a musical interlude.
Say that again.
I wonder if it could be a musical interlude.
Oh, yeah. Okay, good. Yes, a musical interlude. That's an interesting way of thinking about it. Yeah, something. The book has really screwed itself up now to a very tight, taut tension. Huh? The friends have been vanquished. They are gone from the stage. Job is by himself. He's just uttered this powerful demand for his own vindication, his own righteousness, and so it's almost as if it's time now to have this thing solved. And yet, that's not what happens. You get this lovely, it's quite a lovely poem about wisdom. Human beings can do all, they can search in the earth and do mining. And during the period of Job's writing, apparently in the 6th century, there were significant copper mines in the south part of what eventually became Israel. So, excuse me, the notion that one can not find wisdom might be what? A comment on what? Maybe the whole previous dialogue. I mean, both of these, all 4 of these people think they've got wisdom, right? The friends think they've got it for sure. And Job is convinced he's right too. Could this be some poetic way? Thank you. Some poetic way of saying, you don't know what you're talking about. I mean, you can't find wisdom. Only God has the place of wisdom. What kind of arrogance is this to assume you have wisdom? So who might have done such a thing if that's the case? Yeah, Elizabeth.
I'm wondering if this isn't part of trying to show us that all of God's wonderful creation, and that God's wisdom is in every little thing that there is in this world. And that we just have to keep on looking.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it too, Elizabeth, I think, because it does then match in certain respects what happens in God's speeches. Because certainly what God does in those speeches is to portray for Job the full range of God's creation, both the weather and the animals, the whole shooting match of it. And maybe that's part of it. Yeah, that's not a bad way of looking at it. It might be a kind of a prefiguring, if you will, of the God we are about to see, although we've still got a long way to go before to find God, a God we're about to hear from, who is a God who has wisdom in God's self, and nobody else has got it. True. Yeah, good. I like that. What else? Diana?
Well, I just wanted to continue my thought about it being a musical interlude. It kind of goes along with what Elizabeth is saying. It's kind of like the road rage remedies on KUSC at 5 o'clock every day. If I'm driving and it comes on, all of a sudden I remember who I am. I'm not a crazy person. I don't have to be rage filled.
Good. I like that. Yeah, that's helpful, because certainly where we are in the drama right now, there's a lot of rage, that's for sure. The friends have gone off in a fury. I would suggest all 3 of them. And Job is by himself demanding a response from God and expecting it to come any moment. And so maybe this does calm a bit. Maybe this does provide. Now, in certain tragic plays, theater from the ancient world, there were things like this. There were interludes where the gods showed up and commented on the stuff that had gone on. It's where we get that phrase, the Deus ex machina, the God of the machine. And there may very well have been something like a machine, kind of crane, bringing the gods down from on high and then commenting about the plays you've been watching. That happened for sure. Various Euripidean and Aeschylus plays, that occurred. So maybe that's what this is, a kind of Deus ex machina. Yeah, I like it. Okay, what else? Yeah, Denise?
Stepping back a step to where the Eliphaz was giving his speech in recounting things that he claims Job has done or not done, where he's done these things to the poor people and
Right, yeah, right.
stuff. Do we have any way of any other clues throughout the book of whether these things are true? Because we're taking Job's word for it in a way that he's so upstanding, but maybe those guys do have some grievances about things he's done.
Yeah. Well, there is no other evidence of that. I mean, I can only make the assumption, given the bounds of the story that we're reading, that when you read chapters 1 and 2, Job being the most righteous man in the East, and along the way, and he's going to say this again, of course, in chapter 31, if he has done anything quite terrible, may awful things happen to him. I think the whole, all that his last speech in 29, 30, and 31 is going to be is kind of a long liturgical claim that he is absolutely righteous and that he has been helpful to the poor and the widow and the foreign, the stranger, all that kind of stuff. No, we have no evidence outside of what the story itself gives us. True. And I can only say, I think what the narrator wants us to do is to believe that because if we don't believe that, then we can let the problem off the hook, can't we? By saying, well, he's done something bad, so maybe that's why he's getting this. No, the story, I think, is trying to share with us the idea that no, Job doesn't deserve any of this. I mean, that's sort of the essence of it all. Something is being told to us about the moral structure of the universe, which is new and different. I think that's part of what the book is about, but we'll say more about that next week, probably. Okay. Anybody else? Yeah, Elizabeth?
Yeah. And remember, at the beginning, God said to the Satan, have you seen my servant, have you seen my servant Job?
Right.
That he's righteous and he's blameless. So God called him that way.
That's exactly right. Both the storyteller in verse 1 of chapter 1 and God in verse 8 of chapter 1, they say exactly the same thing about Job.
Right.
So in the bounds of the story, yeah, that's who he is. That's who he is, I think. Okay, now let's move on. We got to move along a little more quickly here. Let me point out one thing to you. From the end of chapter 28, there is a kind of a reference here, if you look carefully at it. Truly the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. That's from Proverbs and various other places in the wisdom tradition. To depart from evil is understanding. That is exactly the phrase that we found in the prologue, where Job, the storyteller, and God both say Job departed from evil. It's the same phrase. Has that been understanding for Job? Well, not according to him in the same kind of way. His refusal to depart from his departure from evil, which the storyteller tells us, has not led to any particular great thing at all. Quite the opposite. He has found himself with nothing. So there's a little irony there at the end of the speech of wisdom, even though it generally turns out to be a long, as Diana suggests, maybe a kind of interlude in the story. But we'll come back to, I think, what is another interlude in just a moment. Now we have 3 long chapters of Job's final speech. Well, nearly finally, it's one small one in chapter 40. But in chapter 29, in effect, what Job says is, I wish things were the way they used to be. And notice how things used to be. Oh, verse 2, chapter 29. Oh, that I were as in the months of old, in the days when God watched over me, when God's lamp shone over my head, by God's light I walked through darkness, when I was in my prime, when the friendship of God was upon my tent, when the Almighty was still with me, my children were around me, my steps were washed with milk, and the rock poured out for me streams of oil. It's a kind of hyperbolic speech, of course, about how grand and glorious things used to be. And here's the best, I think, in verse 7. When I went out to the gate of the city, when I took my seat in the square, the young men saw me and withdrew, and the aged rose up and stood. Oh, Job wants that to come back. In German universities, when the faculty member appears in his or her robes, the class is required to stand. I don't know if they do that anymore, probably not. But back in the middle of the last century, that's what they used to.
Only at graduation.
Only graduation, right? So obviously Job remembers when he was the center of everybody's attention. They were in awe of him. The nobles refrained from talking and laid their hands on their mouths. Voices of princes were hushed. Their tongues stuck to the roof of their mouths. I love that. I think this is great. Job wants all of that back because in that way now, it's terrible. And chapter 30 tells you just how terrible it is. Verse 1, chapter 30. But now they make sport of me, those who are younger than I, whose fathers I would have disdained to set with the dogs of my flock. I mean, Job has had a precipitous societal fall, of course, and he now feels the pain of it very keenly. Now, unfortunately, much of the rest of chapter 30 is very hard to read in the language, but I think you can get the essence of it anyway, and that is that Job wishes things were the way they used to be, but now they're not. They're terrible, they're awful, they're miserable, they're terrible, on and on it goes. He describes at great length. My verse 30, my skin turns black and falls from me, my bones burn with heat, my lyre is turned to mourning, and my pipe to the voice of those who weep. That's the Job he now feels himself now to be. But now 31 is what we call in the tradition an oath of clearance. What that means is this. There are several psalms in the book of Psalms that describe in some detail something like this, a liturgical way of saying, I am innocent and am not, I shouldn't be receiving what I'm receiving. An oath of clearance means that when Job goes through this, he's telling you that all the things that he's been accused of are wrong. Listen to how he puts it. Verse 2, verse chapter 31. What would be my portion from God above, my heritage from the Almighty on high? Does not calamity befall the unrighteous? I mean, calamity falls the unrighteous. That's the way it's supposed to work. But it's not working that way. If I have, verse 5, if I have walked with falsehood and my foot is hurried to deceit, oh, let me be weighed in a just balance. Let God know my integrity. If my step is turned aside from the way, and my heart has followed my eyes, if any spot has clung to my hands, let me sow and another eat. Let what grows from me be rooted out. Now, notice how it works. If I've done any of this stuff, may terrible things happen to me. If I've done this, may that happen. If I've done this, that happened. But the fact is, I haven't. If my heart has been enticed by a woman, I've lain in wait at my neighbor's door. Let the wife grind for another. Let other men kneel over her. Oh dear, that's kind of a nasty little phrase, isn't it? That would be a heinous crime. That'd be a criminal offense. That would be a fire consuming down to Abaddon, would burn to the root all my harvest. If I have ever rejected the cause of my male or female slaves when they brought a complaint against me, what then should I do when God rises up, when he makes inquiry? Verse 16. If I have withheld anything that the poor desired, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or have eaten my morsel alone, and the orphan has not eaten from it. From my youth I reared the orphan like a father. From my mother's womb I guided the widow. If I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or a poor person without covering, whose loins have not blessed me, who has not warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I have raised my hand against the orphan, notice he is reacting directly to the claim that he's avoided the cause of the widow and the stranger and the orphan. Those things that the prophet said are the definition of what it means to be a righteous Israelite. And Job says, I've done all those things, always. You cannot accuse me of that. You cannot. I've done it. I've done it. This again, as Denise pointed out, it picks up earlier on that very first, in the prologue, when we're told that Job is the most righteous man in the East. This is his definition of what it means to be righteous, and it is the Bible's definition of what it means to be righteous. It's quite right. So Job goes like this for a good while, long liturgy here of closure, of cleansing. But now look what he does as he gets toward the end of this. Suddenly he gets very direct again about wanting to see God. Verse 35. Oh, that I had one to hear me. If only I had someone to hear me. Here's my signature. Let Shaddai answer. It means he's written his case now, he thinks. Oh, that I had the indictment written by my adversary. If God would write down what I've done and send it to me so we can have our courtroom case together, I would carry it on my shoulder. I'd bind it on me like a crown. I would give him an account of all my steps. Like a prince, I would approach God. He's hurling his honesty and integrity and righteousness right in the teeth of God. And surely we will hear God respond. Unfortunately, we don't. We get 6 chapters of this guy named Elihu. Now, Elihu's name, chapter 32, is really quite long. Elihu, son of Barchel the Buzite of the family of Ram. That's a pretty long moniker for a guy. Okay, now here's my second question of the night, and that is, what's this doing here? What's all this stuff about him? Why is Elihu's 6 chapters here when I fully now expect God to show up after Job has hurled his indictment right in the teeth of God, and I don't get God for another 6 chapters? What's going on anyway? Why is Elihu in this book? Okay, again, anybody's guess. No right answers here. What do you think? Yeah, Nancy?
I think the actor playing God is stuck in traffic.
That's right. Could be. Well, that's facetious, but at the same time, you might be suggesting that this again is a kind of interlude, some kind of interlude before God shows up. Now, exactly what kind of interlude it is the question that I want to raise. Why? Most scholars, I'll say right up front, think this is an intrusion in the book, written by somebody else. The poetry isn't very good, frankly. And perhaps by somebody who thought they had an answer, rejecting the friend's responses and dropped it in here as a way of saying, oh, this is what's right. CP, you should have done this from the very beginning. I think it's more than that, but that's many scholars have said that they think this is a secondary edition, which is the famous language that scholars often like to use when they can't figure out why something is there. Anybody else? Yeah, Elizabeth?
Increase in dramatic tension.
That's exactly part of it. I think that's right. You get so anxious. Now, you've all been to plays, and some plays that are particularly powerful and particularly tension-filled often have places that increase the tension, but at the same time do something else. Maybe take your mind away for a while. Elizabeth, want to say some more?
Comic relief.
Good, exactly. That's not an impossibility here. And I've often read this. I remember years and years ago reading this for the first time and thinking, man, this is boring stuff. And why does this guy take 6 chapters to say basically what the friends have already said? And because he really does. He has nothing new to say at all. But who he is as a character is very funny if, and I did this once some years later than after my first reading, I read this out loud to myself one afternoon, beginning in chapter 32. And it surprisingly, perhaps not so surprisingly, I'd finally discovered or believed, is it takes Elihu fully 25 verses to introduce himself. He keeps saying, you guys have spoken a whole lot, and I'm young, and you guys are old, and I've got things to say, and I've got my mind, my body is like a bag of wind, and I'm like a wineskin ready to burst, and on he goes. And finally, it just becomes ludicrous after a while. You think, come on, boy, get on with it. Say something, will you? Talk. But he just introduces himself for 25 full verses. It can be very funny if you read it out loud. It really can be, as a matter of fact. So I would suggest, here's the analogy that I like to use, and may not be the best analogy, but all of you've all been to plays, so you know, some of you have done plays. I always think of Macbeth, Shakespeare's Macbeth. And I've seen any number of performances of Macbeth. It is by far Shakespeare's shortest tragedy by quite a significant bit, actually. You all know the story, of course. Macbeth meets the three witches on the heath, and they tell him he is going to be the king of Scotland. And first he's going to be the whatever of Fife, and then he's going to be the king. And he can't quite figure that out, but then he contacts his wife, Mrs. Macbeth, and she likes this very much. She'd like to be the queen, of course. And she, when he gets home, of all things, the king, Duncan of Scotland, is going to spend the night with him. Oh, she says, here's a chance. And so she convinces the old boy to murder the king. But don't forget now, if you're going to kill the king, you got to kill all of his guards too, because they're going to blow the whistle on you if you don't. So Macbeth takes his terrible knife up there and slaughters some of the guards, but not all of them, and kills Duncan, and comes back down with his hands smoking with blood. And his wife says, give me the knife, you fool. I'm going out. So she goes up there, she slaughters the rest of them and comes back down, and they're all standing there on the stage dripping in blood. It's just grotesque, of course, monstrous. And suddenly you hear this very loudly, a loud knock on the door. And Macbeth and his wife rush off the stage quickly. A little water cleanses us of this deed, she says. And in comes the drunken gatekeeper. He staggers across the stage, and he's muttering stuff all the time, and he says things about stuff. And it turns out, if you don't listen carefully to what the drunken gatekeeper says, he's commenting on the play. He doesn't know that. He's just drunk, and he's answering the door like he's supposed to do. He's the gatekeeper, after all. And certainly at that point, when the drama is screwed to its very tightest point, when you have witnessed, seen the results of the murder of the king and all of his guards, and Macbeth and his wife have done it, it does something to that tension. It either increases it in a funny way, or gives you a kind of momentary respite from the terrible pain of this monstrous drama that you're witnessing before your eyes. Now, you could do the same thing, I suppose, with Lear and the Fool, who is a much more complex character, of course, than the drunken gatekeeper, but nonetheless, he also is commenting on the play while he is dealing with Lear's madness on the heath. And Shakespeare had an erring ability to take these tension-filled moments and do something with them and make them, lighten them, and yet at the same time increase the tension at the same. It's brilliant stuff, of course, and certainly the greatest writer in our language, I'm sure. So is that what we've got here? Do we have a kind of screwing of the tension, and yet a kind of humorous way of dealing with it all? A kind of humorous. And I think probably we may, and I want to now turn to the end of Elihu's speech, which is chapter 37. The other parts of the speech, they're perfectly readable, but they're not very interesting. They're very long and not really helpful to us. They say the same stuff. Job is evil, and God is getting him what he deserves and all that. But Elihu at the end says something very revealing, which I think is going to be part of the author's concern too. Chapter 37, beginning in verse 18. Can you, like him, spread out the skies, hard as a molten mirror? Interesting enough, this is basically what Yahweh is going to say to Job in Yahweh's second speech, and we'll get to that next week. Teach us what we shall say to God. We cannot draw up our case because of darkness. God is mysterious, hidden away. Should he be told that I want to speak? Did anyone ever wish to be swallowed up? I mean, Job, do you really want to face God? God will swallow you whole. Now, no one can look on the light when it's bright in the skies, when the wind has passed and cleared them. Out of the north comes a golden splendor. Around God is awesome majesty. Shaddai, the Almighty, we can't find him. He's great in power and justice, and abundant righteousness he will not violate. Therefore, mortals fear him. He does not regard any who are wise in their own conceit. God doesn't care at all for people like you, Job, and you can jolly well bet that God is never going to talk to you. Well, surprise, surprise. The next voice you hear is the voice of God. And I always, in the play, I always imagine at this point, as Elihu launches his last lines up there, that he hears the voice of God and rushes off the stage in terror, because it turns out God is going to speak to Job. And that's how things get set up. Now, that's a very long way to do that. I mean, that 6 chapters is a very long interlude, if you will, to move us from Job's demand to see God in chapter 31 all the way to God's final appearance in chapter 38. Well, I think that's one way to hear it. I was the dissertation director of a person who did a dissertation on Elihu, where she argued that Elihu was the first interpreter of the book of Job. That is, that some other person had interpolated these speeches into the book and were commenting on the book. And it was very interesting, actually, and not completely unlikely in my own mind. I wasn't completely convinced by it, but I thought it was an interesting way to get at it. But in terms of the shape of the play, I think this interlude might make some sense, even though I think it's too long. I think maybe many people in the audience would have checked out by now after hearing Elihu go on and on the way he goes on so long and so boringly. Okay, we are now ready to hear from God. Now, here's the question that I want you to think about. We'll have some time for questions in just a moment. I want you to think about for next week, our last time together. If you were writing a speech of God after what you've just read here in all of this book up to now, what do you want God to say? I mean, after all, this book was written by somebody. It's perfectly fine for you to think about what you'd hope God would say to Job. What do you want God to say to this guy? What is important for God to say? So I want you to think about that this week. Expectation in literature is a terribly important thing. What do you hope, anticipate, desire for God to say to Job? And then, of course, we'll have to ask the question, what is it that God says to Job? How do we hear those speeches? Now, let me say tonight, I'll probably repeat this next week, that the speeches of God have been talked about in literally thousands of ways over the centuries. There is no easy way to appropriate how these speeches work. That all of us have the right to make a judgment about what God is saying in these speeches and why they're in the way that they are, and how Job responds to these speeches, and how the famous lines of chapter 42, 1-6 are supposed to fit into that response. As I said to the beginning, how you appropriate the whole story of Job is going to be locked up in your understanding of what you think God is saying in these speeches. So we need to look at them with some care, I'd say. They're long, 76 verses, I think. And they're lovely poetry, certainly the finest poetry in the book. And why? And do they do what you wanted them to do? Or would you rather have them do something else? I've done this all over the place when I've taught the book of Job in various churches in the country and around the world, and asked people exactly that question. If you were writing a speech of God, what would you write? And it's a very helpful question to think about it like that, I think. And I've gotten, oh my goodness, all sorts of responses in all sorts of places, which I found very helpful as people think about this. And I would suggest that that is a kind of very key question I want you to wrestle with over this week, and then to come back and we'll talk about it, perhaps at some length. That's going to be the basic work of next week, to figure out what these speeches are about. Okay? Well, we've got some minutes now for questions. If you want to ask some, I'm always ready. Yes, Denise.
I'm finding myself conflicted because I feel part of me feels like Job and part of me feels like Eliphaz, where I want to say, oh, if something bad happens to me or someone I love, it's not because we did anything wrong. It's just random. But then at the other situations where people do something to you and you just want to think like God is going to punish that person. You just want that to be the case.
Exactly. Yep. It's like the Psalms, isn't it? 40% of the Psalms say precisely that. Psalm 58, oh God, may they dissolve like snails into slime. I mean, it's grotesque sometimes, exactly. But that's the feeling, absolutely right, that I think many of us have. It's quite a natural human feeling. When you feel like you've been unfared against, you want justice, you want vindication. Sure, absolutely. That's good, that's helpful. And I think people who would have read this play or witnessed the writing, whatever it is, I think they'd have the same ambivalence about this. I agree. Yeah. Paul?
So as I read this, it just seems like this is a story about a righteous person and the voices of doubt that afflict you on your path. Mm-hmm. The self-righteous that surround you and make fault of you when you stumble. Those that call out the, what you believe is virtue when you experience poverty despite trying to be virtuous. Those who accuse you of things you've not committed, like deprive the widow and the poor, which they accused him of when you find out later he never did. Right. And wisdom of, the fear of God is the fear of not being loving, righteous, kind, and faithful. Yep. And the Job who clings to that path, despite these voices of doubt and darkness and humiliation, ultimately is vindicated. And in the end, God, chides the voices of those that talk about God's exalted beauty and power and unapproachableness. And the story seems to be one of humble ability to journey with God.
I think that's certainly one way to hear this, Paul. I think you're absolutely right. Many have heard it exactly like that, as a kind of vindication of somebody who maintains a connection with God no matter what, despite the terrors and horrors of his or her own life. Yeah.
And I was just amazed at the juxtaposition of the Sermon on the Mount. Mm-hmm. How the Job account is very similar to what Jesus talks about. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for there is the kingdom of heaven.
Sure. Yep.
Blessed are they that mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. Blessed are you when you are scorned by the wicked.
Right, exactly.
And then again, it's like heaven is ultimately the reward of faith.
At least something like a realm of God, a world of God. Now, the question I'm going to ask you about these speeches of God, is it just as simple as that? Or are the speeches of God rather stranger than that, rather raising sharper, more mysterious questions about the moral order of the universe? Is there something more that the author of Job is trying to share with us than a rather traditional understanding of virtue eventually rewarded? Is there something more? And that's the question I want to raise. I want to raise that one. I don't want to reduce the book only to a kind of vindication of traditional religion. Because I think part of what the author is trying to do is to defeat a simplistic understanding of the nature of God. That's part of what the author's doing, I think. And then the issue becomes for me, well, then what have we got? What sort of God is this? How can we understand, evaluate, appropriate, worship this strange and unusual, mysterious God that we find in these speeches? Well, we'll say more about that next week anyway. Yeah. Okay, anybody else? Anybody else? Okay, well, that's the assignment for next week. Read chapters 38 to 42 all the way through. Not very much. It's much shorter than this time anyway. And we'll really have at it. And again, I warn you, we will not agree about everything, but that's part of what it means to read the book of Job. It oftentimes raises us more questions than it gives us answers. And that to me is great writing. I think it's terribly important not to limit the possible understandings of this book. And all of you will share some things that I'm sure I have not thought of, and I'm looking forward to it, okay? All right, let's have a word of prayer, then we'll be dismissed. Oh God, we are grateful, as always, for this group which has come to share with one another ideas and thoughts about this remarkable writing from so long ago. Thank you for the minds that you have given us. May you help us love you with our minds as much as with our spirits, so that all of us will become your children at long last in this world. We pray in your holy name. Amen.